welcome to iROC, another great session of our afternoon session, learning a little bit more about Mount scholars, their passions, their pursuits, the things that they've encountered through their research. It's a good opportunity for us to engage in that dialogue, hear a little bit about their perspectives, and just share in that conversation with scholarship. So a few housekeeping notes. Anybody that's here, do please make sure your phone is muted. Thank you. Anybody that's joining us online, you can keep your camera off, keep yourself muted as well. At the end, we'll do a Q&A session. We can either moderate through the chat or we'll be able to call on you raising your hands to do it that way. On behalf of myself, John Dammer, Assistant Librarian for Access and Outreach Services, joining me, Dr. Evan Markov, Associate Professor of Biology, and in our chat room, Library Director Vivian Mazarski. We are the iROC Coordinating Committee. Welcome, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn this over to Evan.
Thanks, John. Really happy to introduce our speaker today, which is Dr. Victor Azuaje. He is Professor of Hispanic Studies here at Mount St. Mary College. So Dr. Azuaje earned his PhD in Spanish Literature and Linguistics from Temple University, Philadelphia. Very nice, my home area. He was the winner of the 2020-2021 MSMC ATAC Teaching Innovation Award. His research is in the areas of Latin American literature, politics, and religion. And the talk that he's going to give us today is based upon his contribution to an upcoming book titled Toward a Critical Instructional Design. So join me in welcoming our presenter today, Dr. Azuaje.
Thank you. Okay, let me tell you something about the background first of the whole thing. Well, we had the experience with these hybrid modalities during the pandemic, and for some reason, the ATAC somehow decided that I was going to receive the award, but then I thought, well, that's probably a mistake. So I'm going to try to redeem that committee, okay? And then I started writing some notes of my ideas about hybrid teaching. And at some point, Kristen de la Sala, she saw that and said, oh, hey, Victor, there is this call for contributions from the hybrid journal, the Pedagogy area. And I think that's your area. And then she told me, okay, the deadline is in 2 weeks. And okay, I'm gonna, but you couldn't say no to Kristen, Kristen. So I said, okay, and I did, but I was sure that they were going to say something like, no, when I got the, oh yes. And I said, oh my God, okay, that is the way I'm supposed to do this. The other reason for this is that when I was a graduate student, and at this time in University of Delaware in the Department of Linguistics, they had this habit of every other week, we were going to have a meeting on Friday afternoon, nice meeting. And they were supposed to be for students who were going to present or were writing a paper for a journal. And the idea of that presentation was essentially the student was presenting to the faculty and to the other students. And there was going to be a critique of the work. And I thought, well, this is great. I mean, that's the way you are ensuring that the product that is getting out of the department, it's top notch. This is something at the highest level. And that's why I'm doing this at the iROC. Why? Because I'm essentially, while I'm rereading this, I said, wow, there are some things that I could improve for the final product. So usually I have a PowerPoint, but this is not the idea when you're reading a paper. You want to rely only on the words. I added, let's say I leave some of the more creative sides of this paper here. The editors are saying too much creativity. So please cut that out. But for the reading, I'm gonna leave some of the sessions. Okay, so hybrid teaching is not a limbo, nor a multiverse, And those are lessons from the HyFlex experience. I'm talking about humanistic ideas for a blended future. So first note, the tension between face-to-face and online engagement in HyFlex courses. Welcome to the fall semester of the pandemic year of 2020. 25 students are enrolled in your class. This is a Spanish language course. On Mondays, you teach half of them face-to-face and half of them online, half of them behind their screens, and half of them behind their masks. On Wednesdays, you reverse their roles. Let's assume that you're lucky and you have a desktop and a laptop in the classroom. To teach both groups simultaneously, you open your first Zoom account on the laptop to share audio and video with the online students and log in to your second Zoom account on the desktop to join the session and share the same audio and video with the face-to-face students. All this nightmarish juggling, however, solves only half of your problems. On the other days, you interact with your students as they go asynchronously through content and exercises in the learning management system. To set up the perfect storm, add two other paradoxical disturbances. First, you've been asked to keep your students engaged in every session and modality. But most researchers claim that engaging the students face-to-face has few similarities with engaging them online. Second, your students didn't choose this setting. It was imposed on them because of COVID-19. For the same unforeseen reason, you haven't been provided with a full-fledged HyFlex classroom because there was none. HyFlex wasn't the outcome of an institutional project. It was rather a technical shorthand for the blender of face-to-face and online modalities where anxious administrators poured in students, classrooms, and instructors following an unsteady recipe of shrinking optimized spaces, weekly apocalyptic moods, and updated CDC guidelines. It seems unfair to privilege HyFlex over other hybrid modalities, but again, this isn't due to an academic hype. In 2019, only a few institutions of higher education were offering HyFlex as an option for their students. In 2020, COVID-19 pushed many of them to place it at the center of their offerings. Because of this abrupt move, the term became the umbrella for any combination of online and face-to-face modalities. And though HyFlex stands here for the experience I just described, it will also refer to the manifold of mixed modalities and pedagogical practices and their intended or improvised amalgamation. It also seems unfair to consider on equal footing hybrid instructors and face-to-face or online-only instructors. The whiteboard on Zoom isn't the whiteboard in the classroom. Yet for the hybrid instructor, the two must work in tandem. But more than a divide among instructors about technology, the pandemic revealed a divide between many instructors' assumptions and most student expectations about courses blending physical and virtual environments. Many suddenly appointed HyFlex instructors assumed a motivational and communicational gap between online and face-to-face instruction, envisioning a hybrid modality either as a Limbo equipped with 14-inch monitors and built-in microphones, or as a Multiverse, two separate worlds linked by rotation in the schedule and an unmanageable influx of students' messages. On the other hand, most students expected engaging hybrid instructors and consistent learning experiences across modalities, imagining instructors as producers and hosts of seamless multimedia and multi-presence shows. However, if Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Fallon weren't successful at moving their TV personas from the studio to a room in their houses, with their families as their live audience and their guests via Zoom or YouTube. Why do we expect better performances from instructors switching between a classroom in their institutions and a room in their houses with no script for engaging face-to-face and synchronous plus asynchronous online audiences simultaneously? So a unified approach to face-to-face and online engagement in mixed modalities, the hybrid teaching identity. Talk show hosts had it easier in the fall of 2020. They needed to keep their charm and humor in a room without a live audiences. HyFlex instructors, for their part, had two types of audiences in the same room and lost one or two of their tools to work with half of them. There are two facts about online teaching. You can't rely on your charisma, and humor rarely works. Online students are a tough crowd. In the 2024 semester, I received less than 20 LOLs, and only one student wrote, "I actually laughed out loud and choked on my food when I read this email." That was one. Extremely charismatic HyFlex instructors could then expect to be effective only half of the time with half of the crowd, the face-to-face students. Online students, they are left to an unengaging fate. Since charisma is unreliable and a limited resource, educational researchers have focused instead on teaching identities. For the face-to-face modality, Christy Cooper-Stein and Rebecca Black offer a thoughtful survey. For synchronous and asynchronous online settings, Jennifer Richardson and Janet Alsop summarize the findings. They also share the widespread belief that condemns HyFlex instructors to the limbo or to the multiverse. I quote, "The online teacher identity is significantly and necessarily different from that of a teacher in a face-to-face class. The instructor's sense of teacher self is not an extension from that in a traditional setting, but rather it is a unique creation specific to the online context. The outcome is clear. If you're a face-to-face instructor, create your teaching identity. If you are an online instructor, create your unique identity. If you are a HyFlex instructor, break yourself in two. If you're a HyFlex student, say hello to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde." So Richardson's and Alsop's account takes for granted the gap between face-to-face and online teaching. But in the HyFlex context, this assumption dooms any teaching identity effort because it undermines one of its essential goals. A teaching identity consists, I quote, "consists of sub-identities that somehow should harmonize." And that's a quote by the same authors that are talking about that gap. Radically separating sub-identities is not part of a teaching identity project, and HyFlex instructors should not be considered an exception. They should somehow harmonize their face-to-face and online sub-identities. In doing so, however, HyFlex instructors need to find a way to incorporate Richardson's and Alsop's and similar contributions without assuming an unsurmountable gap between face-to-face and online teaching. This task has now become more present since, I quote, "mixed modality models such as hybrid learning will remain a force even as universities look beyond COVID-19, end of the quote. And that's a stone. For my hybrid courses, I started that project by adopting the dialogical perspective promoted by Paulo Freire and the autonomy-supported teaching style that John Marshall Reeve presented in Autonomy-Supported Teaching, What It Is and How to Do It. Freire's reflection on dialogue laid the common ground for a unified face-to-face and online identity. Reeve provided a set of instructional behaviors compatible with Freire's dialogical attitude, with my students for engagement across modalities, and with my concern for their emotional health in the times of COVID-19. So closing the gap between face-to-face and online engagement, start by creating your teaching persona. Know thyself may not be part of the Socratic method, but Socrates made it a relevant concern of his inquiries. Many instructors consider the search for self-understanding an indispensable practice for the profession. But for all of them, like for Socrates 2,000 years and more ago, that self remains elusive. Faced with the puzzle, educational researchers have put forth proposals whose specifics are as many as the differences in the philosophical or psychological perspectives put together by theorists. Some researchers choose to work with a set of features, beliefs, values, roles, or with a more restrictive idea, the teaching persona. Both approaches are exemplified by Nancy Coppola, Stuart Hiltz, and Naomi Roeder in their article, Becoming a Virtual Professor, Pedagogical Roles and ALN, Asynchronous Environments. The authors are turned in two directions. For example, the term teaching persona is equated with both teaching roles and teaching styles. But their insights about communication highlights our need for what the Brazilian philosopher and pedagogue Paulo Freire called the dialogic attitude. Before we examine how Freire can help us, let's look briefly at the problem that requires his counsel. Coppola noticed how from face-to-face to online environment, instructors' role change, but they don't disappear or become indistinguishable. They remain the common denominator, and roles in turn have a common denominator. I quote, underlying the enactment of all roles is the critical factor of communication. Overt and underlying messages from face-to-face to online environments define the instructor's role, or what Coppola labeled teaching persona. There is, however, a caveat. Failures in communication in one area could taint the whole teaching persona. For example, the asynchronous instructors interviewed by Coppola weren't naive about the prospects of successful communication. They listed many possibilities for falling back into silence or misunderstanding. Lack or insufficiency of gestures, eye contact, voice quality, body movements, facial expressions. 20 years ago, Coppola heard most nowadays complaints about online communication. A teaching persona will then rise or fall on the quality of communication. Those instructors were neither alone nor original. Lamentations over how technology affects the immediacy of communication and our physical well-being are an ancient pedagogical genre. Plato condemned writing because men will call, I quote, things to remembrance, no longer from within themselves, end of the quote. And instructors in Coppola's times didn't Zoom from Zoom fatigue, but fatigue is an old computer-related symptom. Email fatigue, whiteboard fatigue, video fatigue, chat fatigue, screen fatigue, poll fatigue, mouse fatigue, keyboard fatigue, gallery fatigue, okay? Zoom creators didn't design those side effects. They just put them together, okay? That's why furnishing instructors with more or better gadgets or fixing their side effects should not be a post-pandemic pedagogical priority. A better 3D image resolution and a stereo sound won't improve a controlling teaching style. It will only amplify or rely more clearly its disengaging messages. Now, this is neither a Luddite or a rant or a nostalgic chant for an other face-to-face modality. Either one is based on a fantasy. Face-to-face was never the eating of communication. Attitudes and nonverbal clues have always hampered instructors' overall messages. If online modalities have recently shown how disconnected students could be from instructors, face-to-face ones have long shown how alienated instructors could be from students. The hybrid environment only compounds the communication challenges already present in the two modalities. Reading this, hybrid instructors may feel of two minds about communication. On the one hand, communication could mark the end of both the limbo and the two separate worlds, the multiverse, as metaphors for hybrid education. Through consistent messages across modalities, hybrid instructors can build a unified teacher persona. On the other hand, communication is not a magic pill. Misunderstandings happen. Let's address first a way to end the limbo or multiverse, the teaching persona. Coppola's use of the word persona to conflate teaching roles and teaching styles could help us set aside a misplaced emphasis on authenticity when talking about teaching identity. As Jay Parini has observed, persona, the theatrical mask, the social facade, the self-presentation, quote, involves artifice. Authenticity is ultimately a construction, something invented, end of the quote. A romantic educational vision has highlighted authenticity or naturalness, but a hybrid teaching identity is not born. It takes time and training to develop a new attitude. So creating your hybrid teaching persona to engage students, a Freudian approach. But what kind of attitude do a hybrid instructor need to develop? Paulo Freire suggests a starting point. Quote, our method then was to be based on dialogue, which is a horizontal relationship between persons. Don't be deceived by the simplicity of the statement and our familiarity with the word dialogue. First, the English translation has cleaned the definition of its original complexity. In English, quote, dialogue is a horizontal relationship between persons. Cleanly says the English translation. The Portuguese says it less clearly, and I'm gonna go with the translation, literal translation. Is a horizontal relationship between A and B. Notice, no mention of persona. The original formula has the structuralist flair so common among Latin American theorists in the 1960s. But this isn't due to the whims of a fashion. Using the sequence A-B, Freire sets out the contrast between dialogue, horizontal, and anti-dialogue, vertical. Dialogue involves horizontal relationships. Anti-dialogue implies a vertical relationship of A over B. A common reading of Freire, a common structuralist mistake, is to consider A and B as poles in absolute opposition. We could see them instead as the extreme of a continuum. This point of view opens the space to different relationships of power, vertical, and to a new horizontal, critical, I'm quoting Freire, critical and criticism stimulating method, where the two poles of the dialogue are those linked by love, hope, and mutual trust. Second, Freire warns us that dialogue or the creation of dialogical attitude is the most challenging task for an instructor. Quote, the difficulty lies in the creation of a new attitude, that of dialogue, so absent in our upbringing and education. Freire has refined the observation that our training and personal history can thwart the efforts to develop a new attitude. We experienced a deficiency, a shortage of dialogue in our upbringing and education. Given the countless conversations we've had with instructors, classmates, relatives, and friends through the years, the claim sounds impossible. It does not if we view dialogue from Freire's perspective, a relationship mainly based on trust, empathy, and critical attitude. Freire identified our deepest motives to hold anti-dialogical attitudes and gave us the strongest ethical reasons to let them go. He also gave us the foremost pedagogical reason to adopt dialogue as the foundation of our teaching identities. Quote, dialogue presents itself as an indispensable component of the process of both learning and knowing. End of the quote. Now, regarding student engagement, however, Freire's comments about the role of dialogue could be baffling. I quote, in order to begin to understand the meaning of a dialogical practice, we have to put aside the simplistic understanding of dialogue as a mere technique. Dialogue characterizes an epistemological relationship. Thus, in this sense, dialogue is a way of knowing and should never be viewed as a mere tactic to involve students in a particular task. Freire aims here neither at technique to engage students nor at dialogue as a practice that engages students. His target is dialogue as a mere technique to involve students. He marks the spot where romantic notions of empathy and trust are confused with a let them do, I'm feeling good, or I like my teacher pedagogy. As epistemological relationship, a relationship about how we know and learn, dialogue could make instructors and students uncomfortable with the object of study and with each other. I quote, I engage in dialogue, says Freire, not necessarily because I like the other person. I engage in dialogue because I recognize the social and not merely the individualistic character of the process of knowing. Dialogue as a practice to engage students entails taking their perspective and acknowledging their feeling of discomfort, but a dialogical practice is not a group therapy. Freire shed light on the unmistakable, quote, difference between dialogue as a process of learning and knowing and dialogue as a conversation that mechanically focuses on the individual's lived experience. With this distinction, he captures our sense that an instructor must empathize with their students, with her students in challenging conversations, and at the same time assume her authority to engage them in educational directions. In this sense, Freire suggests that educators, quote, should avoid falling prey to the laissez-faire, let them do practice. Okay, on the contrary, okay, a better way to proceed is to assume the authority as a teacher whose direction of education includes helping learners get involved in planning education, helping them creating the critical capacity to consider and participate in the direction and dreams of education. End of the quote. Freire tells us here how the instructor's authority must promote the student's autonomy. Unfortunately, he's been frequently misunderstood on this point. Promoting autonomy requires direction. Quote, I don't think that there is real education without direction. This is Freire. To avoid reproducing the values of the power structure, the educator must always combat, let's say, pedagogy, no matter how progressive it may appear to be. Part of that misunderstanding lies on the English title of his most relevant work on the subject, Pedagogy of Freedom. The Portuguese title resonates better with our purposes, Pedagogia de Autonomia, Pedagogy of Autonomy. The difference between the subtitles is more telling. The publisher in English emphasized ethics, democracy, and civic courage. In Portuguese, Freire chose saberes necessários à prática educativa, necessary knowledge for or wisdom for the educational practice. Saber, both in Spanish and Portuguese, is knowledge, know-how, and understanding, but also wisdom. These quote, I'm going to quote Freire. This theme of autonomy incorporates the analysis of various types of knowledge that I find to be fundamental to educational practice. End of the quote. The pedagogy of autonomy calls for various types of knowledge, mainly know-how and wisdom. These types of knowledge, know-how, wisdom are fundamental to educational practice. And the pedagogy of autonomy is a practice for the instructor and the students. Again, quote Freire, I will know better and more authentically what I know, the more efficaciously I build up my autonomy vis-a-vis the autonomy of others. End of the quote. For an instructor who moves from a face-to-face to online setting and from both of them to a mix of them, Freire sets up an ethical and practical framework to create a reliable teaching persona across modalities. In the classroom, in the Zoom gallery, or in the learning management system, students will always meet with a unique creation based